Chapter 5. The following is a second-hand retelling of how Charles became Wolfman Charles. Imagine, if you will, a nighttime scene set in the dusty, thorny lands of eastern Washington, coincidentally, like yours truly. Imagine the potent smell of a smoking gun and cans of gasoline freshly filled by a hapless clerk while Charles was sticking him up. The robbery isn't too important, which is why I'm skipping the details. The fact that we both apparently hail from eastern Washington doesn't seem all too important either, as much as I'd love to imagine it does. All you need to know is that Charles made off with a bag full of money in addition to the fuel that was now burning in a police chase. Things were looking grim for our hero, with his rusty old stick-shift pickup being the getaway vehicle. The night air was about as hot as the chase, both causing him to drip sweat from every pore. If the law were to succeed in chasing him down, it was going to be a doozy. He'd already fired a shot at a police car that had managed to pull up next to him. Whether he'd killed the officer was hard to say, but at least the bullet had slowed the car down. For the sake of potential charges, Charles could only hope that it hadn't gone through any flesh. The chase was ripping through a highway with a series of hills on either side of it. The road was mostly empty, save for a few unsuspecting drivers here and there, whom both Charles and the cops weaved past as if they weren't pulling over already. Trailing behind him were about 4 or 5 cop cars. As you may have already guessed, things weren't going according to plan. He'd have probably gotten away with it with no trouble had he not taken the time to make that clerk fill all those extra gas cans for him. Right now, despite the predicament he was in, Charles was in his own head, trying to plan where to go and hide from investigators before he skipped town. Wherever it would be, he needed to decide fast, because at any time now he'd turn the corner and... Aw, fuck, there it is. A fleet blocked the road, forcing him to make a smelly, screeching stop. No use in trying to back up with the squad catching up behind him. In the rearview mirror, Charles could see 2 cops running out of the car with the broken window. Well, at least he wouldn't be tried as a cop killer. "Come out with your hands up," the bullhorn blared. The sirens had all gone silent now, but the red and blue light still illuminated the little canyon, taunting him like a flashing game over sign. The mob of officers came running as Charles obeyed the voice. Thump went his face against the hood of his own truck. The handcuffs clicked, and they patted him down. "You have the right to remain silent." "Go fuck your mother," Charles interrupted, but they took no notice. The Miranda rights continued on. Charles tuned it out. He had heard it all before. At this point, a lot of the cops were leaving already. No need for that big of a squad anymore, apparently. Things might have gone differently if they had stayed, because when the search was finally over, and Charles was being marched over to a cop car, the whole place was suddenly shaken by a sound. A low, threatening howl. "What the hell was that?" said one cop. "Sounded like a wolf," replied another. "Kinda strange, considering we don't get much besides coyotes around here." And then it happened. From the other side of the highway, one of the cops screamed. Charles and the 2 cops holding on to him all darted their heads to see what the deal was. Charles couldn't turn around quite far enough to see, but it was something wild for sure, whatever it was. The frightened whispers made that much clear. He could feel their grip on his arms begin to loosen. Then, one of the cops let go of him altogether, drawing his gun and running toward the howling sound. The other, after hastily throwing Charles into the back seat, followed suit. Once inside, Charles was able to see what was going on. Suddenly, he was glad to be locked away behind a barred window. Just a minute ago, these cops all had their guns out just for him. But now, something had stolen his thunder. Some kind of big black thing. With the flashing reds and blues being the only light, it was hard to tell anything about the creature aside from being big and black. Whatever it was, it got up on its hind legs and easily towered over all 7 or 8 of the armed men surrounding it. Even though they were all armed, Charles could tell even from his compromised point of view that they were backing away as the creature inched forward. As it neared, its features became more visible. Thick fur, big teeth, man-like arms, hands with claws bigger than T-Rex teeth instead of fingernails. It prowled, not concerned with petty things like firearms and flashing lights, just with deciding which of these pathetic, sickly little animals it was going to lunge at first. Then it decided. The creature, at least 2.5 feet taller than the man it pounced on, instantly slammed its prey on the ground and started digging in. The rest of the cops jumped back and opened fire. The spark from the gunfire seemed a lot less intimidating than they might have under ordinary human circumstances. Whatever was eating their buddy only felt the bullets enough to jump up and roar at them, loud enough to drown out all the pop, pop, pop. It didn't sound like any animal Charles knew of. It still had a chunk of cop between its teeth, complete with a shred of uniform. The creature, From its crouched position, lunged again, and down went another. No longer did it waste time trying to pin anyone down and eat them. Chasing was the game now, catching them and biting the neck or the collarbone while it used those claws to tear them open like stuffed toys. The last victim, the one who'd put Charles in the back seat, was attempting the world's fastest 50-yard dash for the car, keys in hand, but his swinging belly indicated that he was long past his track and field days. The monster caught up quick. He was about 5 feet off before he was caught. Charles crouched below the window and peeked over just enough to see the action. The monster was up close and personal now, and clearly a werewolf. He hadn't believed in werewolves since he was a kid, and even then he'd figured he could beat a werewolf's punk ass, but now, as an adult, watching a man get his chest clawed open and screaming like a girl, he didn't feel quite as confident. Charles ducked under the window. He'd seen enough. He sat, trembling, hoping he could just wait out the attack. The screaming stopped. The only noises now were tearing and chewing, snorting and growling, and, for lack of a better term, huffing and puffing. Despite all the mortal terror, Charles managed to crack a smile when it dawned on him that he'd just gotten to see a bunch of pigs get eaten by a big bad wolf. Not only that, but if the big bad wolf were to leave soon without eating him, too, he might be able to make an escape. Too bad nobody would believe the story if he lived to tell it, inside or outside of prison. Slowly, quietly, Charles slipped his legs over the cuffs and brought his hands in front of him, then sat still again. The consumption noises stopped. Everything went silent. Then, the window exploded. The werewolf's arms barged in and caught hold of Charles's chest. The pain was great, and so was the shock, but Charles had been shot and stabbed before. He was able to keep his head and managed to slide out of the monster's reach, but not before getting a good gash in from the claws. At this point in the story, Charles stops to show me the claw marks, visible even through his ridiculous amount of chest hair. These, he said, were the initiation marks he'd mentioned earlier. Cowering on the other side of the back seat and oozing blood from its chest, Charles stared directly into the eyes of the beast, snarling and gnashing its teeth as it tried to wrestle its way inside. Its shoulders were so massive that it couldn't squeeze through the window at any angle it tried, save for just an arm and a head. After an eternity, it finally gave up to Charles's great relief and wandered off, huffing and puffing, over the hills and far away. After waiting a few minutes and bleeding quite a bit, Charles, clutching his wound, took a look around through the window. The coast was as clear now as it would ever be, he figured, so with lots of pained wincing and a couple of extra cuts from the shattered glass, he slid through the window where the werewolf had mutilated the bars. Shreds from the dead cop's uniform would have to do for bandages at the moment. With all that blood, they stuck to him pretty easily, even with 4 or 5 layers of cloth. The keys to the cuffs dangled conveniently from the belt. Once his hands were free, Charles dug around in the officer's pockets and found the keys to his truck and his cigarettes. He lit one, and while he smoked, unzipped his pants and took a fat piss on the dead cop's face, right over his still open eyes and into his gaping mouth. Last but not least, he took the gun from the holster and headed back to the truck. That night, Charles slept in a motel room, knowing it wouldn't be wise to return home. He covered his wounds with a spare hoodie under his coat at the check-in and tossed the hoodie in the trash once he got to his room. The bleeding had stopped, but looking in the mirror, he could tell it would be a hot minute before his chest would heal. He rinsed the splatter off in the shower but left the bandages on. The news on the TV, of course, reported on the slaughter. He listened intently for the reporters to mention his name, but they never did. They were apparently too concerned with the animal nature of the killings and the fact that investigators had already found evidence of a canine attack. Because there were so many men, and it could be seen that they'd all fired a few shots each, it was decided that they'd been attacked by more than one animal, a pack in all likelihood. But a pack of what? Coyotes were the only wild dogs in the area, after all. More updates when the police go back and check through the dash cameras. Though he didn't seem to be much of a concern to the police at the moment, Charles knew that such an incident would call for a thorough investigation. It was still very possible that they'd come looking for him, especially with that broken window and the open handcuffs next to the car. The plan to lay low was still in effect. Best case scenario, they'd figure he was dead too. Worst case, they'd blame him for the killings on top of everything else, and what would his alibi be? A monster broke through the window? It was possible. He couldn't have bent those bars, and he did have a giant set of claw marks on him. He wasn't sure exactly which cars had stayed and left before the werewolf showed up, or where the ones left were facing, so the dash cameras saving his ass was a coin flip. It was all a big headache that he hoped to avoid anyways. His final decision was to flee the area the next day. First, though, he was very tired and needed to heal up. Sleep came quick and hard, without dream and black as the monster's fur. Boom, boom, boom. It was light out now, and somebody was pounding on the door. Charles awoke with a jolt and scrambled for the gun he'd taken. Please, he thought, please don't be cops. Gun cocked, he looked through the peephole. It wasn't cops. Big sigh of relief. Charles holstered the gun in his pants and ran to grab his coat and cover the crusty shreds of police uniform stuck to him. Still, the visitor banged on the door. Charles just about broke his neck rushing to open it. The visitor, who definitely wasn't cops, was an old, fat native man with long, flowing hair that hung over his shoulders and partially covered the Bud Light logo on his t-shirt. Through the small crack in the door he allowed, Charles greeted him. "Can I help you?" The man's belly shook as he laughed with a voice as deep as the ocean. "Probably not, bro," he replied, "but I bet I could probably help you." Charles laid his hand on the gun in his pants. "I don't need help with anything." The man laughed again. "You sure about that, bro? 'Cause, He looked comically from left to right. "I happen to know a little something about, animal attacks." Charles's heart skipped. "Like what, exactly?" "Well, for one thing, bro, I know shit can get a little weird when it's dark out. And the moon is full." "What the fuck do you want?" "I just want to help you out, man. But if you don't need any, that's cool too. I can just go." The man turned to leave. "Wait," said Charles, and the man stopped. "What can you do to help me?" "Well, I imagine you don't want to stay around and pay another $60 for this room, which you're going to have to do in about," he checked his phone, "20 minutes. So if you want to follow me, I got beer at home. That is, if you like beer." "Yeah, I like beer." "Well, fuck yeah, then. I'll wait outside if that's cool with you, bro." "Yeah, sure, 1 minute." Charles slammed the door. Might as well, he thought. And besides, if anything should go wrong, he was armed. He took a deep breath and opened the door. "That was quick," said the Indian. "Yeah," said Charles. "There wasn't much to pack." "Works for me. You got wheels?" "Yeah, I got a truck." "Bitchin'! Would have been quite the walk otherwise." "You need me to drive you then?" "If you don't mind, bro." Charles sighed and rubbed his eyes. "Sure. First, though, what was your name again?" "Oh, my bad, bro. They call me Grandfather Red Eagle." He stuck out his hand. "And you are?" "Charles," said Charles, shaking Grandfather Red Eagle's hand. "So where are we going exactly?" "Idaho." "What the fuck's in Idaho?" "The crib, bro. I got a cabin." So into the truck they went, and Grandfather Red Eagle directed Charles back to his cabin in Idaho, paying for a tank full of gas first because, in his words, that motherfucker was way far up Idaho's ass. When asked how he knew about the werewolf incident, the Indian just laughed and slugged Charles on the shoulder, telling him not to worry about it. Charles isn't quite able to put his finger on the exact location of the cabin. The only way he can find the guy now is by his scent, and so far it seems to be leading him in the same direction. And yes, he adds, Grandfather Red Eagle is his OG. The Indian turned out not to be lying about living in a cabin, and a proverbial cabin in the woods at that. Its closest neighbor was a gas station convenience store about a mile behind it. Charles wasn't too crazy about how far it was from civilization, bearing the possibility that he might end up inconveniently trapped with someone he'd barely met, someone who knew exactly where he was staying after he'd been arrested and escaped with all the witnesses having been mysteriously ripped to shreds, all the way from up Idaho's ass. He went with it anyways, though, because as sketchy as that sounded, it'd be even worse to stay in Washington right now. The cabin was small, as any good cabin is, and a sofa with a beaded tapestry draped over it divided the living room from the kitchen. The centerpiece of the living room was a bulking coffee table, also draped with a beaded tapestry. The table combined with the sofa made the living room dual purpose, also serving as the dining room. Grandfather Red Eagle gave Charles the nickel tour, pointing out the bathroom and the refrigerator. "What's mine is yours, bro. Mi casa, su casa." And soon they were clinking cans with the case in front of them on the table. Once they'd each had about 3 beers, Grandfather Red Eagle finally broke out of the small talk. "All right, bro. Now that we're chilling out and you know I ain't got any kind of ill intentions or nothing, I gotta come clean about something." He set his beer down and turned to face Charles, who sat ready to hear whatever it was, but only setting down his can because it was empty and he was pulling out another. "Reason I know what happened to you, and the reason I knew where to find you and everything?" He paused, taking a sip and setting the can back down. "Reason I know all that shit is, I was the one that got you." He paused again, waiting for a response. Charles said nothing, just raising his eyebrows and nodding slowly, chugging down the rest of his beer. "I was able to track you down," said the Indian, "'cause I got the smelling sense." He pointed to his nose. "And the smelling sense lets me know where my brothers are." "Your brothers?" said Charles. "Are we related or something?" "No, not like that, bro." The Indian laughed rather nervously, relieved that Charles wasn't freaking out on him. "We're like brothers in the spiritual sense now, 'cause you got the spirit of the demon wolf like me." He slapped Charles on the shoulder with a heavy hand. "And pretty soon, you'll have the smelling sense too, and you'll be able to find me wherever you go, and all the rest of our brothers and sisters who got the spirit too." "Why would I want to find them?" "Because, bro! It's a crazy fucking life when you got the spirit of the demon wolf. We gotta stick together, help each other out and shit, you feel me?" "I can handle myself all right, man." "Oh, bro, you gotta humble yourself, homie. Your life with the demon wolf is just starting out. You're just a little pup still." "A little pup?" "Not like that, bro." Grandfather Red Eagle waved his hands in front of himself for emphasis. "I'm just saying, like, you only got the scratch yesterday. You don't really know how to handle that shit yet. It's why I brought you here, bro, so's I can tell you what's what. That way you're not out here struggling, you feel me? 'Cause it's hard when you first starting out. It's real fucking hard. Trust me, I know. Check this shit out." Grandfather Red Eagle pulled up the sleeve of his Bud Light t-shirt to reveal his shoulder, showing Charles the scars from his own bite mark. "I got this shit back in '73, bro," he began. "I was at a Rush concert over in Boise, and I was heading back on foot, 'cause back then I was really into hiking and camping and shit, and it was dark too, and I was walking by the side of the road, running through some woods, and out of nowhere this big fucking wolf man pops out, and he roars at me just like in the fucking movies. Probably the way I was when you saw me. And I knew I wasn't tripping when I saw him either, 'cause I had some shrooms at the concert, but that shit already wore off like 6 hours before then. Anyways, he was all roaring at me, and I was like, holy fuck, bro, that's a goddamn wolf man. And he comes at me, and he tackles me to the ground, and he takes a big old chomp out of my shoulder, as you can see here. And I tell you what, man." He finished off his beer as a way of dramatic pause. "I tell you what, by the grace of the Great Spirit, that's God, or how us Redskins know him, by the will of the Great Spirit, I happen to have this big old fucking can of bear spray on my hip." He tapped his hip where the bear spray had apparently been. "And even though that fucker was all on top of me, trying to gobble me up for dinner, I was able to whip that shit out and let him have it, right in his eyes. And then, once I'd just about emptied the can on his ass, he finally took off, and that's how I'm alive today, telling you the tale." He took out another can of beer. While he'd been speaking, Charles had already sucked down 2 more. "That's a pretty crazy story, man," said Charles. "But I gotta be honest, I don't see how that makes us brothers or whatever the fuck you're talking about." "Hold on, bro, that's not the whole story." The Indian wagged his finger and took a sip. "After that shit happened to me, and I went to the ER and got checked for rabies and all that, I woke up home the next day, and if you can fucking believe it, my wounds were all healed up already. And I bet you money if you checked yourself out right now, you're gonna see the exact same thing." Charles began to unzip his coat to check, but Grandfather Red Eagle waved his hands. "Not right this minute, bro," he said. "I gotta finish telling you first." He cracked open another beer and continued. "I swear to you up and down, cross my heart and Hail Mary, the shit I'm telling you right now is the most important shit you're ever gonna hear." He took a deep breath and rubbed his forehead. "Sorry, bro. I don't mean to boss you around or nothing. I just gotta lay it all out for you before I lose my spot and forget, you feel me?" "Yeah, I feel you," said Charles. "Go on." "Okay, thank you. So anyways, Wait, where was I? Fuck." Grandfather Red Eagle slammed his fist on the table. "Actually, you know what? Let me get you something else to throw on so you're not burning up in that coat." He got up and headed toward what was probably his bedroom. Charles could hear him shouting all the way from the couch. Suddenly, Charles realized something. From the moment he'd stepped out of that motel room and all through the drive from Washington to Idaho, he hadn't once removed his coat, and it occurred to him that he was actually sweating like a pig, or a fat policeman, same deal. It only took a second of wondering why he still had his coat on to remember the gun he was hiding in the front of his pants, the gun that he'd almost revealed a moment ago when he started to unzip. He stood up, reached underneath, and shifted the gun around to his backside. All the while, Grandfather Red Eagle spoke to him from the other room. "So anyways," he called, "after I got home and realized all my shit was healed up, I got up and went to the store and shit, and when I got back, there was this dude waiting on my front porch, just chilling out, smoking a stogie like he owned the goddamn place. And I was like, hey, what are you doing at my house, bro? And he's like, sup, man, my name's Jim, you want to smoke? So I'm like, all right, bro, whatever, this better be good and all. And he sits me down and explains to me, like, that he knew that I was just bit by a werewolf and shit, right? And he was the one that bit me. And he tells me what I just told you a minute ago about the smelling sense, and a whole gang of other shit that I'm going to tell you about in just a minute. Grandfather Red Eagle came out of the bedroom with a robe and tossed it to Charles, who'd just removed his coat. His torso was bare except for the blood-crusted cloth stuck to his chest. Grandfather Red Eagle made a face. Damn, bro, he said. That's some pretty nasty shit right there. He squinted. Aw, fuck, he said. Is that from a cop uniform? Charles shrugged. Gotta use what's there. Oh, hell no, said the Indian. You killed a cop for his fucking shirt? I did. You did. Grandfather Red Eagle put a hand to his forehead. Oh, fuck, man. There wasn't cops, was there? He thought for a moment and said, Well, fuck it, I guess. You ain't a convict then, are you? Yes, but I haven't been convicted of what I was getting arrested for. Well, they ain't gonna get you now, bro. They laughed and bumped knuckles. Grandfather Red Eagle insisted that before Charles put the robe on, he should first remove the bandaging. Charles said he wasn't so sure about that. The blood had clotted up pretty good, and it might be messy if he took it off now. Nonsense, cried the Indian. It's all healed up now, guaranteed. Charles ended up standing still and letting Grandfather Red Eagle rip it all off, just like a regular Band-Aid. As he grabbed hold, Charles braced for sharp pain, but it never came, at least not like it should have. It felt more like a sticker coming off than a wad of bloody gauze. Sure enough, the only mess was the dried blood already stuck to him. The scratches, though visibly deep, looked more like they were years old than acquired just yesterday. He stroked them with a ginger touch, but they didn't even sting a little bit. He pressed on them, expecting at least a little soreness. Nothing. Yup, said Grandfather Red Eagle. You got the demon wolf all right. Sorry for giving it to you and everything, but honestly, bro, I gotta say congratulations. You're part of the tribe now, and if you stay smart and watch your ass, you're gonna live for a long damn time. It took about 7 more beers and a lot of lively bullshitting, but when Charles was finally nodding off and swaying back and forth, Grandfather Red Eagle was able to convince him to stick around and learn the ropes, and since the feds were probably looking for him, it was decided that Charles stay in the cabin for a while and sleep on the couch. Me casa su casa, bro. Not that any jail would be able to hold him once the full moon came around again, but until then, laying low was the smartest thing to do. Let him think you're dead, the Indian told him. It's better for them than it is for you. During the course of his stay at Grandfather Red Eagle's cabin, Charles learned a great number of rules for life with the spirit of the demon wolf, the new superpowers he'd develop and how to use them, the signs of pre-transformation, and the best shaving products on the market. Most importantly, he learned that other beings exist in this world alongside the demon wolf, beings far more sinister, many of them known to the human race only through legends and folklore. These beings will be revealed to you, dear reader, later on. Chapter 6. So how does it feel to transform? I was on my 3rd beer as I asked this question. Charles was on his 5th, or 6th, or 7th, or 10th, hard to really say. In character with the story he'd just told, Charles was now quiet, smiling faintly with his eyes closed, head bobbing slowly up and down. I waited for his answer, not moving a single muscle. Charles raised his hand in the air, palm facing upward, as if he were questioning something that hung over his head. With eyes still closed and that dopey, drunken smile still on his face, he opened his mouth to speak. I was a bit startled, but didn't show it, by how much his teeth had already grown since he'd opened his mouth last, just a few seconds ago, a whole centimeter maybe. He opened his eyes at the same time, and they already had the look of a wild man by default, but now they were somehow even more animal. His pupils were bigger. Their blue color now had a metallic shine to them, and overall, they just seemed a little less conscious than before. The change happened so quickly, I only noticed it after it had already happened. Charles, grinning and talking casually, seemed not to notice at all. I had to contain my surprise in order to focus on scribbling down whatever he was about to tell me. I would just have to make note of it later. Any answer that started with an introduction like that had to be too good to miss. Well, said Charles, it's what we call a slow process. He took 3 or 4 gulps and continued. Sometimes it's slow and steady, and other times it's kind of like bones breaking, all throughout your body. Very, very fast. Damn, I said. That hurt like a bitch or what? Well, honestly, yes and no. It does hurt, like Don't get me wrong, it's excruciatingly painful, but it's also just really fast, you know? Once my bones are done, he pointed up and down his ribs with both hands, changing into the new shape. He shrugged his shoulders and gave his ribs a pat. It stops hurting, literally in a split second. So what, you just deal with it then? Let it be? Basically, it's easier to get through it when you're shit-faced. Got it. That explains quite a bit, actually. Charles said nothing to that, only pointing his finger at me. Only pointing his finger at me as if to say, bingo. I made a few more notes, and we concluded the interview. I had several pages worth of notes now, spanning well past the day he came to the cabin. I told him I'd start on the rough draft tomorrow. Truth be told, I had the energy in me to start right then, but I knew I'd be damned if I could hope to concentrate on writing with him in the room, already in the process. I told him, casually as possible, that I was going to go for a walk, maybe grab a snack. "Hold on," he said, nearly choking on his beer. "You gotta wait, so you can see what happens with my hand." "Well, shit, man," I said. "How long's that gonna take?" "Within the hour, for sure." "All right, well, I want a pack of smokes and some ice cream or something, so if it's within the hour, I should be fine heading to the store and back." "Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead and get me a pack, too." He handed me $40 and away I went. Outside it was dark, and the air bit my fingers. I put my hands in my pockets. On my way to the end of the parking lot, a man in a hoodie with a face tattoo asked if I had any clear. I told him, "No, sorry, man," and he said, "That's cool, have a good one." "You too, buddy." Crossing the street, I could see a few people standing outside of the convenience store, 5 or 6 of them maybe, hanging out and smoking. They all wore clothes like mine, black beanies, heavy coats, and backpacks, though mine had been tragically ripped away from me, all except for one individual. It was a lady, small in stature, wearing a black dress and a little black hat. While the others were grouped together by the ashtray, bullshitting and having a good time, this woman stood off by herself at the side of the building, making dramatic hand gestures with a smoke in her hand, talking to some imaginary friend. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I knew it couldn't be her, but as I came closer and got a better look, I knew it had to be. The narrow face and the crazy eyes gave it away from 100 feet off. Mama D had followed us. It couldn't be possible, though. She couldn't have found a ride this far and this quick, let alone track us down. And yet, there she was. My heart raced. Would she remember me? She'd have to. She'd tracked us down after all. How mad was she going to be about the whole tire iron incident? Probably furious. Yeah, but what's she gonna do? Use her dopehead wizard powers on me? I had a moment of internal debate, then decided to just go on ahead anyways. I could ignore her just fine. What was I afraid of? I was probably just leaping to wild conclusions with that imagination of mine. Like the great Zig Ziglar said, fear is just an acronym for false evidence appearing real. I kept all this in mind as I approached the store, understanding it intellectually, but still being scared shitless. I made a turn, wide as a semi-truck, and walked into the store from the side opposite to where Darcy was standing. Not once did I glance in her direction, but I did keep watch from the corner of my eye. I couldn't make out what she was saying to her imaginary friend. Just like in the woods back in Utah, she sounded more like a rabid animal than a person, growling and gnashing her teeth at the empty air. The people standing by the ashtray, also tweakers by the looks of them, took no notice of her. At least they didn't seem to. Their conversations carried on naturally. Of course, that didn't necessarily mean anything. They'd probably all done the same type of thing at least once that week. I avoided them too. I bought a pack of spirits, a pack of Marlboros, and a little bucket of ice cream. I commented to the clerk that the folks outside seemed pretty live tonight. She sighed and said that was a part of working nights at a gas station. I chuckled and said, "Damn, well, as long as you can handle it, I guess." She told me to have a good night. The chill on the back of my neck was even colder than the night air when I stepped outside. Darcy was calling to me from behind. "Excuse me, hun, could I just have a moment? I just need to use a phone real quick. I just had a terrible emergency, blah, 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 blah." I kept walking. Clearly that did no good, because a tap on my shoulder rattled my nerves and stopped me in my tracks. I yelped out a "whoa" and jumped about 15 feet the other way. "What up, homie?" Darcy stood with her legs spread in a power stance with her arms out in front of her as if to say, "Bring it on." "Oh, hey, how's it going?" I forced a smile, hoping she'd buy it. "How's it going?" Darcy waved her arms around like a 90s rapper. "I'll tell you how it's going. My feet are on straight up fire, homeboy." Oh, yikes. I looked down and saw that she still had those same bandages on her feet, just a bit more tattered. I took a sidestep towards the sidewalk. She took a sidestep at the same time, so I couldn't get out of facing her. "Well, yeah," she said. "Hell, I was running so damn fast I couldn't avoid it." She smiled at me, presumably her attempt at showing warmth, but it just wasn't happening with those pirate teeth. "You know how it is," she said. I said, "Oh, yeah, for sure. I know how it is. Shit sucks, no doubt. Good luck with that." An awkward pause ensued until I figured out what to say next. "Well, anyways, good luck with that. I gotta get going." This, of course, was a test, or something of a bluff, implying to her that I was totally comfortable with just walking off like it was nothing. As far as she let on, it was working. "Well, all right, young man," said Darcy, now standing tall with her legs together and hands on her hips. "Just mind that you stay away from the suits." "Suits?" I was backing away now. Darcy wagged her finger at me. "Damn right," she said. "And if you see any of 'em creepy crawling out around here, don't you tell 'em a thing, 'cause if you do, they'll come after you. Sure as sunshine." "Do you mean cops?" "No, I don't mean cops, silly boy." She gave me a playful tap on the chest, which sent a short but intense wave of shivering through all my nerves. There was no breeze, and the night air was chilly, but not that chilly. No way it wasn't her touch that did that to me. I did my best not to jump again like I'd just done a second ago. I stepped back, light as a ballerina, so as not to let her see my fear, assuming she couldn't smell it already. "I mean the suits," said Darcy. "Those boys with the hats and the shades, like they want to try out for the Blues Brothers. They don't like me because they're jealous of my political office." "As Queen of the Animals?" "No, not that. That's just my birthright. I was born with it. You know this." As a matter of fact, I did not know this, nor did I believe it, but I didn't say it out loud. "So what's your office then?" At this point, I was starting to forget my fear and remember how fun it was to listen to dopehead ramblings. She hadn't turned on the angry eyes yet, so I wasn't too paranoid, but I still kept in mind that in all reality, she really should not have been there. "Why, I was the senator for 13 years, she cried. "Well, that's pretty impressive," I said, "but I really need to be somewhere right now." "Oh, of course! I'm so sorry for keeping you so long, hun. Just remember what I told you." "All right," I said, walking away. "Thanks, have a good one." Finally, I got away from that horrible woman. As I crossed the street, out of the lamplight and into the shadows of the closed businesses and sleeping houses, hopefully where she couldn't see me, Darcy called out one last warning. "Watch out for that moon," she yelled after me. I glanced backwards and saw her still standing there, staring me down from afar. Now her stance was like a quarterback, squatting down with her arms out in front of her. Even from 100 feet off or more, I could see her teeth as she grinned from ear to ear, less like a granny and more like a big bad wolf. The angry eyes were out now too, cutting through the night and zeroing in on me like the laser sight on a sniper rifle, waiting for the right moment to go pop and scatter my innards all over the pavement. I made no reply, just picking up the pace and running away as fast as I could without actually running. I was still darting over my shoulder when I got to the motel parking lot. How the hell did she find me? There had to be something she knew that I didn't. Not only that, but there was no way she didn't remember Charles knocking her out with a tire iron and waking up with her cash missing. She had to have come for retribution. What kind of retribution? I tried not to ponder. If she could change places that quickly and track us from so far away, there was no telling what else might be up her sleeve. And clearly, she was holding something back, or why would she have been so cordial with me just now? Maybe I should have just given her my shoes. I scanned the keyboard, hoping against hope that Charles would have the faintest idea of what the hell was going on. Exploding the door open, I got to see that he was now only dressed in a pair of extremely baggy sweatpants. I made no comment on it, nor did I tell him right away who'd just shown up in town, because all that would require great concentration, and I suddenly realized how much I had to take a piss. I dropped my little grocery bag on the floor next to the bed where Charles lay in those weird potato sack pants. I ran to the bathroom. Having to get up and walk around after a long period of sitting always disturbs my bladder, as does beer, and it didn't help that I'd just seen a wrinkly old spook at the gas station. Once I was done doing my business, I threw myself from the bathroom and nearly stumbled onto Charles's hairy, disgusting body. I panted, "Charles, something bad is going on." "No shit," said Charles, also panting. "What do you think this is?" Now that I was all up close and focused, I could see now why Charles had changed clothes. He was sweating, right through his beard and all the rest of his fur hair. Little droplets glistened on the small window of his face where there weren't as many whiskers. Writhing around in pain, eyes shut tight, Charles raised his right arm. The palm of his hand was still pretty much bare, save for little tufts of silvery baby hairs around the wrist. Though devoid of much wolf fur at the moment, his hand wasn't truly completely bare. Something was on it now. Thin lines made of burn or scab, looking fresh enough to be puffy but old enough not to be cracking or bleeding, arranged in a cookie-cutter shape with perfect curves and angles, formed a pentagram large enough to cover his entire palm. This was all very exciting and everything, but I was forced to one-up his surprise with a much bigger one. "Darcy's here!" I cried. "Darcy who?" Charles looked up like he was barely able to think right now, let alone remember back to what was likely the 50th tweaker he'd smacked with a tire iron. "The crazy lady from Salt Lake! She was at the gas station over there." Charles rolled over on his belly. "So? So, I think she's pissed about us knocking her out and taking her money." "I did that," said Charles into his pillow. "You didn't do shit." "Okay, whatever, it doesn't fucking matter. The point is, she's crazy, she's pissed, and some fucking how she was able to track us up here. Do you know anything about this?" Charles, instead of answering verbally, snailed his way down to the other side of the bed and reached down to pick up his other pair of pants off the floor. With a bit of fumbling, he pulled his belt off to free his sheath and knife, letting it fall onto his chest and slide off his belly next to him. "Take it," he muttered, also into his pillow. "Watch your back. You're gonna have to hold the fort down for a while." "What do you want me to do, fight her?" "Go for the jugular," said Charles. "The chest is good, too." "But she traveled all the way over here. She shouldn't have even known where we went. She's obviously got fucking powers or something, man." Charles rolled back over to face me again, holding himself up on one arm. Like Darcy, he too was in some kind of angry eyes mode, but instead of looking like pure evil sent from hell, his eyes just looked sort of animal. They'd already changed a little like I mentioned earlier, but now it seemed like they were fully beast and no man. They were still that same silvery blue, but now they gave off an actual glow in the dimness. His pupils were massive, and so were his teeth. Fangs had begun to protrude out of his mouth and stretch down below his bottom lip. Despite all this, he still talked like a person. "I was able to knock her out, right?" he quizzed. I said, "Yeah," taking the sheath and knife. "Okay," said Charles. "So if I was able to do that, then it can only mean she's not invincible, right?" "Yeah, that's true," I said. He had me beat there. There wasn't really a choice anyhow, with Charles about to go prancing off into the woods or whatever he planned on doing. I would just have to grow some balls and deal with it. I sighed and looped the sheath onto my own belt. "So anyways, what's up with the MC Hammer pants?" Charles sprung out of bed without warning when I asked this, then fell to his knees on the floor next to me, stretching his arms out in a bowing position. It was hard to tell him apart from a dog when he stretched. Same thing when he got up and shook himself, sprinkling me with loose hairs and sweat droplets. "They stretch," he said, now towering about 10 inches over me, "and they won't rip when I'm going through the motions. But like I was saying, this mark here," he held up his hand again, or rather, his paw, with the pentagram still on it. "This shit basically means it's gonna really start kicking in here pretty soon, which means it's time for me to head out for the night." "Well, all right," I said, remembering my grocery bag and picking it up. "Cigarette time, then?" I tossed him the Marlboros and he caught them. "It's always cigarette time." "She was talking about suits," I said, outside the door with a cigarette in hand. "You got any idea what she's talking about?" Charles popped his back and stretched, savoring the cold breeze running through his sweaty fur. He took a long, indulgent drag, then spoke. "I think so," he said, "and you'll probably know too, if you see any." "So what the hell is it, then?" "Honestly, I don't really know," said Charles, pausing again for another dramatic cigarette puff. "Not enough to really explain it to you. But if you do think you see a suit, as she called it, you definitely don't want to make a whole lot of noise." I nodded, pausing for a drag myself. "So I'm guessing they're like feds or something?" "I don't know," said Charles, "but I can tell you I've caught them watching me a couple of times before." "So they are feds," I said. "If they're watching you, you're a fugitive, right?" "Well, yes, but I don't think the feds are actively looking for me. I don't really get stopped by regular cops like that, and I guarantee the cops don't give a shit about Darcy either. If she's getting shit from these guys, she's probably into some weird shit like I am. I don't get it, I said. Why is it that you're so sure they're not feds? What else could they be? Charles shook his head. I don't know. I've tried finding out. I can't find any type of organization that really fits their description. Way I see it, though, good rule of thumb is, if they look like feds, they're probably just as bad to get mixed up with. The subject still bothered me, but I dropped it. Charles told me, over another cigarette, that he was going to go off into the woods now. He was going to trust me with his wallet and keys while he was away, adding with a smile more canine than ever that he was sure I'd figured out by now that I couldn't hope to run off with his shit and get away with it. I threw up my hands and assured him I wouldn't dream of it, while at the same time dreaming of a far-off future when I'd be too rich to put up with any of that tough guy talk. The time wasn't then, though, and truth be told, I'll probably never be above taking lip from a changing werewolf. When cigarette time was over, Charles told me good luck and hobbled off, holding his pants up at the waist with one arm, and then he was gone. I clasped my hands against the knife he'd given me, scanning the dark, sleepy parking lot. I paid careful attention to the shadows between the street lamps. Everyone knows that's where the spooks like to hide. I sucked away the rest of my cigarette and flicked it away. There was still a good 6 or 8 beers left in the case to keep me company. This was a real treat, being as I was still too young to go buy my own. I would have traded them all for a joint, but I figured it best to appreciate what I had and get some writing done on top of it, knowing it was what Zig Ziglar would have wanted. Those notes I had sitting by the case were about to make for some interesting work. Chapter 7. Fast forward that same night to about 3 in the morning. I was on my 6th beer of that sitting, which is quite a bit for the likes of me. I was surprised I hadn't gotten sick yet, but not surprised that the room was no longer stable. The beer I was on was for the cool down. I'd just slugged out about 5 pages, only getting up every once in a while to piss the beer out. Now I was just sitting, staring at the blank television on the wall in front of me. I knew I needed to do something to calm my nerves after all that writing. I find that discharging more than 3 hours of words tends to leave my brain in a jumble, with little phrases, ideas, questions, and so on swirling around like a tornado, chucking dust and sharp objects all at the panicking Oklahoma townsfolk. That's how I look at it, at least. People talk about the creative juices flowing like it's something to be desired at any time of the day. Not so. If the machine doesn't get a chance to cool down, it runs the risk of shitting on you, just like my Subaru. Good lord, that damn piece of shit Subaru. I knew I shouldn't have even been in this motel room, or anywhere in the state of Idaho for that matter, dealing with werewolves and a supposedly Cherokee witch doctor bitch or whatever the hell she was supposed to be. I should have been in Colorado Springs, sitting in a different motel room, paid for by the company, counting up sales revenue for the day over whiskey and cigars or some other cool shit like that. That was still the goal, of course, but what the hell was I supposed to do to make that happen at this point? Before I left Washington, I made a vow that I'd never work in a restaurant again. The thought of breaking that vow made my stomach feel like taffy being stretched and pulled apart in a factory. Think positive, man, I thought. You're going to be just fine. Like Zig Ziglar said, positive thinking won't let you do anything, but it will let you do anything better than negative thinking will. This had long been a reassuring motto to hold on to, but now I had to admit to myself that I was having a serious crisis of faith. This train of thought chugged on until I finally snapped out of it. I'd been pacing the floor, devouring my fingernails. You need to quit worrying so goddamn much, I said to myself. Remember what Dale Carnegie said? Worrying gives you ulcers. I threw my coat back on and stepped outside with a cigarette bobbing around between my lips. The place was quiet and dim aside from a lit-up room here and there with people standing outside and smoking just like me. Cigarette time for the night owls, presumably. The night owls don't confer with each other during our cigarette time like the normal people do, though, since we all have the same troubles on our minds with no solutions. Someone popped around the corner. I nearly shit my pants, but then I realized it wasn't Darcy. You got an extra cigarette? The man who breathed out that question through his wispy beard peered at me from deep inside a hoodie, tied up around his head and draped over with a camouflage. I said, yeah, man, for sure, and I pulled one out for him. You need a light? He took it with a gentle hand. No, I got one, he said. But thank you, though. His voice reminded me of a shaky old dog, traumatized from years of kicking by heavy boots. His hand moved at a snail's pace to the breast pocket of his camo jacket, digging around for about an eternity before he finally found his lighter. When he sparked it and held it up to light his smoke, his hands began to shake, even more than his voice. Still, though, he managed to light up, then he took a puff and wheezed out with just enough breath for me to make out the words. "Thank you, son." "For sure, man, it's all good," I said. "What's your name?" "Joseph." "Nice to meet you, Joseph. My name's Nicholas." I shook his hand like I was handling a glass sculpture. "My pleasure," he whispered. I pointed to his camo. "You a veteran?" "United States Marine Corps." "Oh, nice." That was all I could think to say to him. I was already able to tell he was a veteran just by the look on his face, that look of having spent years being bossed around and slamming booze night after night. How so many of these guys end up on the streets is mind-boggling, but at the same time pretty understandable. "They wouldn't let me into the military," I said. "Oh, how come?" "I got a nut allergy." "Oh, that's all?" "Yeah, I go into anaphylactic shock. They don't want to deal with that." "Well, ain't that something," said Joseph, taking a puff. "I got the same thing, but with shellfish. Didn't matter any to 'em, though. Drafted me anyhow." "Where to?" "Vietnam." "Damn," was all I could say. He nodded. "Yup, got drafted. They sent me over there. Saw some real ugly stuff. Come back, been looking for a job ever since." Jesus H. Christ. I wanted to give the guy a fucking hug. I knew a Marine wouldn't be into that, though, so I made him an offer instead. "Well, I'm out of beer," I said, "and I'm too young to go buy my own, so if you want to run to the store over there and pick up some 40s for me, you can chill in the room with me and have some." He whispered, "Okay." "Here, I'll go with you and wait outside." So off we went. I would rather have stayed behind so as not to run into Darcy again, but I had to go with because, homeless veteran or not, I knew better than to just give him money and trust him to come back. To my relief, Darcy wasn't there, as far as I could tell. I gave a 20 to Joseph and told him to grab some Bud Lights plus whatever he was into. "Bud Light is good," he said, and went inside. I waited on the sidewalk and lit a stogue. I looked left, right, and all around, scanning those shadows between the street lamps. I felt the way a deer must feel when it gets a whiff of Charles in the forest, except I couldn't tell the difference with just my nose. I had no choice but to treat every corner like there was a viper behind it. Best not to worry, though. Worrying gives you ulcers. Joseph came back out with a shopping bag and we headed back to the room, where we drank much and spoke little. I tried striking up some dialogue, but his replies were short and often mumbled. I asked him my favorite question to ask an old man. "So, you got any advice for a young buck?" He drew in a long breath and paused, searching for a good answer, then said, "Never fear and never worry, 'cause it's all gonna be over with eventually." "Damn," I said. Never heard that one before. "Yup, it's what the sergeant said to us right before we went to raid a little village." "Oh shit, did you at least get to have a smoke beforehand?" "Nope, didn't start till I was home already." I nodded and said nothing. A long silence ensued and we drank. Joseph was staring at the floor, as he had been for most of the night. In fact, thinking about it, I don't think he'd even once looked me in the eye up to that point. A little later, though, he did, when I asked him the final question. "Hey," I said. "Weird question, but I gotta ask. Do you believe in monsters?" His eyes were brown. For the first time, I was able to see their color when he finally met my gaze. They were big, too, tired and sad, but not at all bloodshot. In the moment of noticing that little detail, I suddenly realized this man wasn't on any drugs. No, he was a clean-cut man at heart, probably from a wholesome background, and a good soldier, too, something told me. Probably better than I would have been by a long shot. With this in mind, his answer was all the more interesting. "Yeah, I believe in monsters," he said. "Most of them human beings." "Most?" Joseph nodded and finished his beer. I handed him another, pressing for him to elaborate. "So if it's only most, then what would the other ones be?" "Well, some of them are more animal-like, but some of them kinda in between, I suppose." With that, he changed the subject, rubbing his eyes and complaining about being tired. I offered him a bed for the night, but he declined, saying he had a spot up the road where his stuff was. I walked him out the door and told him it was a pleasure to make his acquaintance. He said likewise and thanked me for the drink. Before I shut the door on him, I gave him an unopened 40 and another cigarette. When he was gone, I took a very long shower. Then I went to bed, where I didn't fall asleep until about 6 in the morning. Chapter 8. I didn't wake until dusk the next day. I turned my head to look at the other bed. No Charles. He must have been on his second transformation already. Blinking a few more times, I noticed the flashing lights. I scrambled out of bed and ducked under the window to peer out. 5 or 6 police cars were all grouped together, right in front of my room. Jesus H. Christ, what the fuck did you do this time, Charles? I kept staring out the bottom slit of the window blinds, starting to freak out. But then I thought, if the sirens aren't still blaring, then they must have already been parked there for a while. Surely, a pounding on my door would have woke me. I wasn't in trouble, at least not yet. But what about Charles? Was being dragged away the reason for his absence, and I'd slept through the whole thing? No, impossible. The full moon was out, and if they were dealing with Charles, he would have already dealt with them, and they wouldn't be out walking around and talking to each other like I could see them doing. I threw on some clothes and grabbed my cigarettes, then stepped outside. I stood quietly by the door, smoking, eyes widened and brows raised like I was just another bewildered bystander with no idea why the parking lot might be crawling with law enforcement. Definitely not a big, furry, hungry, probably drunk idea. I figured it best to dip out for a bit, so I headed to the convenience store. As I was nearing the edge of the motel property, I caught a glimpse of the crime scene from another angle. There was a yellow tape, cameras flashing at a particular spot on the ground, and a white cloth draped over a human-sized lump in the middle of it all. I sped my walk. Outside the store were the usual bums by the ashtray. Before I could get to the door, one of them called to me. "Hey bro, did you see all that shit going down at the motel over there?" "Kind of," I replied. "I saw the fuzz over there for sure." "I saw what happened," said the bum, staring me down with his bug eyes. "It was the homie, bro." He looked down and shook his head. "Shit was fucked up. Some crazy bitch just ran up on him, tackled him and shit, and she just started fucking eating him, taking chunks out. Who the fuck would do that? He was a fucking veteran, man." "Wait," I said. "A veteran? Is his name Joseph?" "That was his fucking name, but he's fucking dead now, dog." "Holy shit! I literally just met him last night." "Well, then you're lucky as fuck, 'cause you got to be blessed with his presence before he left this fucking world." The bum shook his head again and smoked. "It's fucking bullshit," said another. "Joseph was a good fucking man. Never did me wrong. Fucking Vietnam veteran, bro. Who would ever want to kill Joseph?" I had an idea, but I didn't say so. Instead, I asked a question for my own benefit. "So, the chick who did it," I said, snuffing out the butt of my cigarette. "Did they get her?" "Nah, man," said the first bum. "I was over there when she ran up on him. I tried to run over there, help him and shit, but she just upped and bailed before I could get over there." Tears began to well up in his already reddish eyes, making them look like they were soaked in tomato juice. He continued, "I tried to chase her down, but she was fucking crazy fast, bro." He pounded his chest and raised his voice. "I used to be a fucking track star in high school, bro. I'm telling you, no human being can run as fast as she did." The tears finally broke loose. He wiped his eyes and turned away. One of the companions put a hand on his shoulder, then looked at me. "Listen, man," he said. "I don't know what you've seen or where you're from or anything, but watch your step on these fucking streets, man. People get in too deep with these drugs and they don't give 2 shits no more. Don't matter if you're an old man or a soccer mom or whatever." "His face was all fucked up," the first man interjected through his sobbing. "And his neck, man. And his throat." He fell back into crying again. I stood with a mostly blank expression, hiding my shaking hands in my pockets. "Anyways," the other guy said, "the point is, be careful as fuck out there. I can see that you're young and everything, and I ain't trying to talk down at you or nothing, but I'm just saying, these people get high enough, and it gives them fucking superpowers." I told him I understood and thanked him for the advice. I slipped away into the store and went straight for the bathroom. I didn't use the toilet, just the sink. I splashed water in my face and stared in the mirror, talking to my reflection. The only word I spoke for the first 30 seconds or so was, fuck. I rubbed my eyes and my scalp, then went back to staring in the mirror, head in my hands, elbows on the sink. "Okay, so I'm in trouble," I said to my reflection, "and if I don't plan this shit out, I'm gonna be fucking dead." I stared at my reflection in the eyes with burning intensity, and it stared back. I do this often. The idea is to hopefully make the pep talks I give myself more effective. I was trying to drill the truth into my own head, the truth that I was well aware of but having trouble coming to terms with. I stood up and crossed my arms. "Dead," I said. "Deader than shit. Probably by tomorrow. You got this knife, but that's it. You gotta use your head. Be prepared." prepared like a fucking Eagle Scout. I lifted my shirt up and tucked it behind the sheath, then pulled the knife out. Yeah, man, you just need to watch your back, and if she runs up on you... I slashed the knife at the air. I paused to admire the knife. It was big and black with an inch-thick handguard. There was nothing fancy about it, no designs or structural curlicues. It wasn't made for showing off. Whoever manufactured this knife had killing in mind, no more and no less. The sheath was equally simple. The dark leather was sewn together with one thick thread with a snap button strap. Where'd you find this one, Charles? I felt the knife's weight in my hand. Earlier, I described it as the biggest, scariest knife I'd ever seen. Biggest because, well, it was massive. Combined with its heavy-duty handle, the blade about a third longer and twice as wide, stood several inches above my head when I lined it up for comparison. Scariest because along with its hulking size, the gleaming steel of the blade curved down so steeply that just looking at it would force you to imagine how easy a time it would have poking a hole in your flesh, and how it might feel when the rest of it went in, making the wound wider and wider and wider. For the rest of my session in the bathroom, I practiced stabbing and slashing at the air, having no idea what I was doing, but hoping to figure out some kind of technique that I could use on Darcy later on if I had to. When I was done playing Three Musketeers, I resheathed the knife and said one more thing to my reflection before I left. Remember, the jugular's always good, but the chest is good too. I left the store without burying anything, zipping past the ashtray committee, and speed walking to the crosswalk with my hands in my pockets. All the while, I constantly scanned in each and every direction. Worrying, of course, gives you ulcers, but then again, a little primal paranoia could mean the difference between living long enough to get an ulcer or just dying right here and now. The motel parking lot was the most unnerving part of it all. The cops were gone, and so was Joseph's body. With no police lights, everything was back to silence and shadows. I slowed my stroll as I passed the gate so I could sense my surroundings a little better. I had to turn a couple of corners to get to my room, turning so wide I could see behind them before I got too close. So far, nothing. It couldn't have been later than 8 o'clock, which was why I found it strange that nobody was outside and, as far as I could tell, no lights were on either. At last the room was in sight, just across the parking lot. I sped back up, looking left and right a few more times just in case. Just when I was a mere few steps away, a giant beam of light turned on behind me. 2 beams, actually. My heart just about exploded when I heard the engine start up and shatter the quiet. I spun around to see a large vehicle coming at me, fast enough to show intent. Just as I was about to dive out of the way, it screeched to an abrupt halt right in front of me. I froze. I'd been expecting to be rushed by a cannibal tweaker. I wasn't prepared for this. So much for the whole Eagle Scout thing. The engine continued to run while I stood there. The lights in my face made it impossible to see who the driver was or even what kind of vehicle I was looking at. 2 doors open. 2 men stepped out. An ugly feeling rose up in my stomach, and it told me the knife wasn't going to do me any good on this one. The men stepped in front of the shining headlights, and I could finally see what they looked like, though the lights behind them gave them a shadowy appearance. The first thing I noticed was how freakishly tall they were, 6.5 feet at least. The second thing I noticed was that not only were they both very tall, but they were also exactly the same height. Fedoras on their heads and matching black and white secret agent get-ups, I knew at once that these were the suits. They walked up to me while I stood in the same spot, only stopping when they were so close I had to tilt my head straight upwards to look them in the eyes. Except, I couldn't look them in the eyes. They were covered up by big circular sunglasses. It wouldn't be until well into the encounter that it would occur to me to wonder why they were wearing shades when it was already so god-awful dark outside. Shouldn't that have impaired their driving? One of them spoke. "Are you Nicholas Madison?" Not only was the question itself unnerving, but this man's voice was monotone to the point of sounding unnatural. After a good few seconds of mustering up the courage, I managed to stammer out a reply. Yes, why? "Mr. Madison, we'd like to discuss with you the events that took place on these premises earlier this evening," said the other one. When he spoke, his voice was basically a carbon copy of his associates, just with the frequency dialed down a few notches. Their faces were identical, too. White, 30-something by the looks of them, clean-shaven without the slightest hint of stubble. It was hard to tell if they even had eyebrows. Narrow skulls with slightly protruding cheekbones, and skin so pale that they gleamed under the moonlight. Very quickly, these men began to cause me the most nausea-inducing dread I'd ever felt with just their mere presence. I played dumb, hoping they wouldn't know any better. You mean the guy that got jumped a little bit ago? Yes, that's correct, the first man said. And we've gathered from interviews with other guests at this establishment that you were seen interacting with the assailant outside a convenience store. Oh, well, I was so terrified of these men that I could hardly speak English. The engine roared on, further clouding my thought process. You're not in any trouble, the first man said. We just want to know about your interaction with the assailant. What can you tell us about an elderly Caucasian female wearing a black dress and hat from last night? I tried to speak, but my racing heart kept any audible words from escaping my lips. The second man followed up on this question. Mr. Madison, you do know what individual we are referring to, correct? Yeah, I gasped out the answer at long last. I mean, I didn't know it was her that did it, but it makes sense, I guess. She kind of seemed, I don't know, out of it. Like, not all there up here? I touched my finger to my temple. You're not familiar with this individual? The first man asked. You have no name or other background information? Well, no, not really, I said, lying through my teeth. She said her name was Mama D, and she was asking me for shoes. Shoes? The second man inquired, both of them leaning in with perfect synchronization. Yeah, I said, calming down when I realized how much they didn't know. She didn't have any shoes on, and she said her feet were burning from running a lot. I think she was on drugs or something. Upon my saying this, the suits turned their heads ever so slightly to look at each other, then back at me. Is this the only encounter you've had with this individual? The first one asked. Yeah, I lied. And, honestly, I'm not really comfortable with this anymore, so if I could just get back to my room... Mr. Madison, we appreciate your cooperation and will honor your request, said the second, but in turn we have a request for you. The first leaned in closer to me than ever before, forcing me to tilt my head back even further to the point of pain in my neck. Having him this close gave me a strange and terrifying feeling, like there was some kind of static charge coming off of him. Not only did it feel electric, but also cold, colder even than the winter air enveloping us. His words were akin to audio commands from a computer, a very stern computer. Do not, under any circumstances, he said, share this information with anyone. That includes the press or local authorities, added the second, leaning in also and doubling that static buzz. If you do, there may ensue unnecessary consequences. But wait, I protested, using every ounce of courage left in my guts. Why can't I talk about it? Don't I have free speech? As soon as I said this, the cold buzzing intensified, and suddenly I was completely overwhelmed with anxiety. I could feel my pulse speeding up to a rate that couldn't possibly have been healthy. Coupled with this anxiety, another feeling crept in, something from the very back of my reptilian brain, screaming at me that nothing about this was in any way natural. Mr. Madison, we don't have the time for debate, the first man said. We have your identification from the motel's guest records, and if it comes to our attention that you've shared this information, there will be consequences. For the sake of your own interests, do not be difficult. Shamefully, all I could manage to do was nod and say, all right. I was then thanked once more for my cooperation, and they finally left. As they turned away and walked back to the vehicle, the buzzing faded. They drove off, and now that there weren't any lights in my face, I could see that they were driving a big, white van. The last thing I noticed before they turned the corner was that they had no license plates.